During a meeting about my husband's inheritance, my son turned to me and said, "You're just the widow, Mom. This is for real decision makers now." He had no idea I held the original will. And when it was finally read, he realized he wasn't one of them. I sat in the mahogany-paneled conference room, my hands folded in my lap, watching my children treat me like I was invisible. The irony wasn't lost on me that this was the same table where Harold and I had shared countless family dinners back when David and Jessica actually wanted to be around us. David, my 35-year-old son, had positioned himself at the head of the table like he already owned everything. His expensive suit and confident posture screamed success. But I knew better. I knew about the 3 failed businesses Harold had quietly bailed him out of. Jessica sat beside him, perfectly manicured fingers drumming against her designer purse, checking her phone every few minutes as if this whole thing was beneath her attention. "Mom, we called you here as a courtesy," David said, not even looking at me. "Dad's gone now and someone needs to handle his affairs properly. Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching." The lawyer they'd hired, some young woman in a sharp blazer who couldn't be older than 30, spread documents across the table. She'd been addressing David and Jessica exclusively since I walked in, as if I were just there to serve coffee. "Based on the will your father shared with us," she said, "the estate will be divided equally between his children. Mrs. Patterson, you'll receive the standard widow's portion, which should be sufficient for your needs, sufficient for my needs." I bit back a bitter laugh. These people had no idea what my needs were, or what I'd sacrificed to hold this family together for 38 years. Jessica finally looked up from her phone. "We've been thinking, Mom. The house is way too big for you now. David and I found a nice little apartment complex for seniors. It has activities and everything. It's closer to that nice grocery store you like," David added, as if he knew which grocery store I shopped at. He hadn't been to my house in 6 months. I watched them discuss my future like I wasn't sitting right there. David wanted to sell Harold's construction business immediately. "The market's hot right now," he kept saying. Jessica was already planning to liquidate his investment portfolio. Neither of them had worked a day in that business. Neither had sat through the late nights when Harold worried about making payroll or providing health insurance for his employees. "What about Harold's wishes?" I asked quietly. The room went silent for exactly 3 seconds. "Mom," David sighed, using that patient tone he'd perfected during his brief stint in management training. "Dad's gone. We have to be practical now. You wouldn't understand the complexities of running a business. You're just the widow, Mom. This is for real decision makers now." Those words hit me like a physical blow. Just the widow. After 38 years of marriage, after raising his children, after holding his hand through chemotherapy, after making sure he died surrounded by love instead of alone in some sterile hospital room while his children were too busy to visit, I looked at Jessica, waiting for her to defend me, to show some trace of the little girl who used to crawl into my lap during thunderstorms. But she was nodding along with her brother, relieved that someone else was handling the difficult conversation with Mom. The lawyer was shuffling through more papers. "There are a few minor bequests to consider. Some personal items, a small trust for Mrs. Patterson's living expenses." "We'll handle the personal items," Jessica said quickly. "Mom gets sentimental about things that don't really have value." I thought about Harold's workshop in the basement, filled with tools that had built half the houses in our neighborhood. I thought about his father's watch, the one Harold wore every day for 20 years. I thought about the photo albums I'd spent countless hours organizing, chronicling every birthday, every holiday, every milestone these ungrateful children had achieved. "Now, about the house," David continued. "We'll need to move quickly. The real estate market won't stay hot forever." They had it all figured out. Sell everything, split the money, park Mom somewhere convenient where she wouldn't be a burden. David was already talking about using his portion to expand his latest business venture. Jessica mentioned something about a European vacation she'd been planning. I sat there listening to them carve up Harold's life's work like vultures, and something cold settled in my chest. Not anger, not even hurt anymore, just a crystalline clarity about who my children really were. "I think that covers everything for today," the lawyer said, gathering her papers. "Mrs. Patterson, we'll be in touch about the details of your relocation. My relocation. As if I were a piece of furniture they needed to store somewhere." I stood up slowly, my purse clutched in both hands. "I understand perfectly," I said. David looked relieved. "Good. I'm glad you're being reasonable about this. Mom, it's what Dad would have wanted." I looked at him for a long moment. Harold would have been heartbroken to see what his son had become. But Harold had known. Toward the end, when the pain medication made him more honest than usual, he'd told me things about our children that I'd tried not to believe. Yes, I said quietly. I'm sure it is. I walked out of that conference room with my head held high, leaving my children to celebrate their victory. They had no idea that the real meeting was scheduled for next week. The one with Harold's actual lawyer, the one who'd been his friend for 25 years, the one who held the real will in his office safe, the one that was going to change everything. Driving home from that meeting, my hands were shaking so badly I had to pull over twice. Each time I closed my eyes, I heard David's voice. You're just the widow, Mom. Just the widow. As if everything I'd been before Harold died had simply evaporated the moment they lowered his casket into the ground. I sat in my car outside the house Harold and I had called home for 28 years, staring at the front porch where I'd taught both children to ride their bikes, the same porch where I'd waited up countless nights when they missed curfew, where I'd celebrated their graduations, where I'd held Jessica when her first boyfriend broke her heart. When had I become invisible to them? I remembered the exact moment I'd given up my teaching career. David was 6, Jessica was 3, and Harold's construction business was just taking off. He was working 16-hour days, and I was juggling a full-time job with 2 small children who needed their mother. The decision seemed obvious then. Harold was building something for our family's future, and I would build the foundation at home. Just for a few years, I told my principal when I turned in my resignation, until the kids are older and Harold's business is more stable. Those few years stretched into decades. Harold's business grew from a 2-man operation to employing 47 people. I became the invisible force that made it all possible. I managed our household, raised our children, and handled every crisis that would have pulled Harold away from work. When David broke his arm in 3rd grade, I was the one who spent 6 hours in the emergency room. Harold was closing a deal that would fund our mortgage for the next 3 months. When Jessica got mono during her senior year and missed 2 weeks of school, I was the one who fought with her teachers to let her make up the work. Harold was in Springfield, bidding on the largest contract his company had ever pursued. I never resented Harold for it. We were a team, building something together. But somewhere along the way, my children stopped seeing me as anything more than the person who handled the inconvenient parts of their lives. David went to college on Harold's dime, changed majors 4 times, and graduated with a degree in business that he immediately decided wasn't for him. Harold never said a word about the waste of money. When David wanted to start his first company, Harold co-signed for a business loan without hesitation. When that company failed within 8 months, Harold quietly absorbed the debt. The second business lasted longer, almost 2 years. David blamed the failure on market conditions, on unfair competition, on everything except his own inexperience and refusal to listen to advice. Harold bailed him out again, this time with $40,000 from our retirement savings. He's learning, Harold would tell me when I worried about the money. Every failure teaches him something. The third business never got off the ground. David had grand plans and bigger expectations, but no real understanding of what it meant to build something from nothing. When the investors pulled out, he came to Harold with his hand extended once again. This time, Harold made him ask for it directly. I still remembered that conversation. David had sat in our kitchen, wearing a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, explaining why he needed $60,000 to pivot his business model. He spoke to Harold like he was pitching to a bank, all buzzwords and projections. He never once acknowledged that the money would come from the same man who'd worked with his hands for 40 years to build what David was so casually asking for. Harold gave him the money. He always gave them the money. Jessica was different, but not better. Where David was demanding, Jessica was manipulative. She'd learned early that tears and guilt worked better than direct confrontation. When she wanted something, she'd present it as a necessity, not a want. The car she needed for college became a safety issue. The apartment she wanted became a study environment requirement. The credit card she maxed out became temporary emergencies that were always someone else's fault. Mom just doesn't understand how expensive things are now, she'd tell Harold when I questioned her spending. She's never had to manage money in the real world. The real world. As if managing a household budget, stretching every dollar to make sure there was enough for everyone's needs, somehow didn't count as real. When Harold got sick, really sick, both children suddenly became very busy. David's latest business venture required his constant attention. Jessica had just gotten engaged and was drowning in wedding planning. They visited, of course, but their visits felt obligatory. They'd sit by Harold's bed for exactly the right amount of time, say exactly the right things, then leave with obvious relief. I was the one who slept in the hospital chair for 6 weeks. I was the one who learned to read his oxygen levels, who memorized his medication schedule, who held his hand through the worst nights when the pain was too much and he couldn't sleep. I was the one who fought with insurance companies and researched treatment options and made sure he never felt alone. David visited twice a week, usually for about an hour. He'd bring Harold updates about the business, as if Harold was just taking a temporary leave and would be back next month. Jessica came by on weekends, armed with magazines and flowers that Harold was too weak to appreciate. They meant well, I told myself. They were dealing with their grief in their own way. But I noticed things, like how they both checked their phones constantly during visits, like how they seemed more comfortable talking to the nurses than to their dying father, like how they'd find excuses to step out when Harold's pain got bad, leaving me to comfort him alone. The day Harold died, David was in a business meeting. Jessica was at her final dress fitting. I called them both, and they came immediately, but Harold was already gone. I'd held his hand as he took his last breath, whispering all the things I'd wanted to say but hadn't found the words for while he could still hear them. At the funeral, my children played their parts perfectly. David delivered a eulogy about Harold's work ethic and business success. Jessica read a poem about fathers and daughters. Everyone commented on what devoted children they were, how proud Harold must have been. I stood there listening to them eulogize a man they'd barely made time for in his final months, and I felt something crack inside my chest. Not grief this time, but recognition. They were grieving the idea of their father, the successful businessman who'd provided for them. But they'd never really known Harold the man, the husband who'd held me through 3 miscarriages, who'd learned to braid Jessica's hair when she was little, who'd stayed up all night helping David with science projects. Now, sitting in my driveway after that humiliating meeting, I finally understood what Harold had been trying to tell me during those last weeks. When he'd grip my hand and whisper, "Margaret, you need to know something about the will," I'd hushed him, told him not to worry about such things. I should have listened. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Harold's last words to me about the will, how urgent he'd seemed when he tried to tell me something. I'd been so focused on his comfort, on making sure he wasn't in pain, that I'd dismissed what he was trying to say as confusion from the medication. At 3 in the morning, I found myself standing in our bedroom, staring at Harold's side of the closet. His clothes still hung there exactly as he'd left them. I hadn't been able to bring myself to pack them away yet. The familiar smell of his cologne lingered faintly on his shirts, and for a moment, I could almost pretend he was just downstairs in his workshop, tinkering with some project. I started going through his dresser drawers, not really sure what I was looking for. In the bottom drawer, underneath a stack of old t-shirts he wore for yard work, my fingers found something unexpected. A small brass key, attached to a piece of paper with Harold's handwriting, safety deposit box, First National Bank, for Margaret's eyes only. My heart started racing. Harold and I had always shared everything. We had a joint checking account, joint savings, joint safety deposit box, where we kept our important documents. What could he have hidden from me? The next morning, I drove to First National Bank with trembling hands. The key felt heavy in my purse, weighted with secrets I wasn't sure I wanted to discover. Mrs. Patterson, the bank manager, Mr. Coleman, greeted me with the sympathetic smile people had been giving me since Harold's funeral. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine, thank you. I need to access Harold's safety deposit box." I showed him the key. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Box 247? I thought you might be coming in for that one." Harold was very specific about his instructions. He led me down to the vault, a sterile room lined with small metal doors. Box 247 was larger than our usual box, and when Mr. Coleman turned both keys and pulled out the metal container, I could see it was packed full. "Take your time, Mrs. Patterson. Ring the bell when you're finished." Alone in the small viewing room, I lifted the lid of the box with shaking hands. On top was an envelope with my name written in Harold's careful script. Below that, I could see stacks of documents, photographs, and what looked like legal papers. I opened the envelope first. "My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you found what I've been trying to tell you. I know you think our children are just going through a difficult phase, that they'll mature and appreciate what you've sacrificed for them. I used to hope that too, but I've been watching them, really watching them, for the past few years, and I need you to know the truth about who they've become. I've kept records, Margaret. Every loan I've given David, every bill I've paid for Jessica, every conversation where they've shown me exactly what they think of us. I've saved their text messages, their emails, their voicemails. I need you to see them the way I see them, not through the eyes of a mother who loves them unconditionally. There are 2 wills in this box. The one the children have seen, which I showed them to keep them happy and prevent them from pressuring you while I was sick, and the real one, which I had prepared by Tom Morrison, my old friend from law school. Tom has the only other copy. Margaret, you gave up everything for our family. You sacrificed your career, your independence, your dreams, and you never complained. You were the backbone of everything we built, And our children have never acknowledged that. They see you as their personal servant, their emergency fund, their safety net. They don't see you as a person with your own value and your own needs. I won't let them treat you the way they've been treating you. You deserve better. Look at everything in this box. Read it all, then decide what you want to do. But remember, Margaret, you don't owe them anything more than you've already given. All my love, Harold. P.S. Call Tom Morrison when you're ready. His number is on the back of this letter. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the letter. Harold had known. He'd seen what I'd been too stubborn or too hopeful to accept. Our children didn't respect me. They never had. I started going through the contents of the box systematically. There were bank statements showing every payment Harold had made to David's failed businesses. The total was staggering. Over $200,000 in 5 years. Money that should have been our retirement, our security, our emergency fund. There were credit card statements for Jessica, all the bills Harold had quietly paid without telling me, designer handbags, expensive restaurants, a vacation to Europe she'd claimed was a girls' trip, but had somehow cost $8,000. Then I found the printed emails and text messages. My stomach turned as I read them. David to Harold. Dad, I need you to talk to Mom about her attitude. She's always questioning my business decisions and it's affecting my confidence. Can't you get her to back off? Jessica to Harold. Mom is being weird about my wedding budget again. Can you handle her? She doesn't understand that this is a once-in-a-lifetime event. Tell her to stop being so cheap. David to Jessica. Did you see Mom's face when Dad had to go to the hospital again? She looked so annoyed, like his illness was personally inconveniencing her. Jessica to David. I know, right? She acts like she's the only one who cares about Dad, but then she gets all martyrish about it. It's exhausting. The messages went on and on. They talked about me like I was a problem to be managed. A burden to be endured. They criticized my cooking, my clothes, my opinions. They made jokes about my age, my lack of understanding about modern life. They referred to me as Mom, in the same tone other people might use to say, the hired help. But the worst ones were from after Harold's diagnosis. David to Jessica. How long do you think this is going to drag on? I can't keep taking time off work for these hospital visits. Jessica to David. I know. And Mom is being so dramatic about everything. Dad's not even that sick. David to Jessica. We need to start thinking about what happens after. Mom's going to be a wreck and someone's going to have to handle Dad's business. Jessica to David. At least we won't have to worry about money. Dad always said everything would go to us kids. They'd been planning my future while Harold was dying. They'd been calculating their inheritance while I was sleeping in uncomfortable hospital chairs, holding their father's hand through chemotherapy treatments they were too busy to attend. I sat in that sterile bank room, surrounded by evidence of my children's true feelings about me, and felt something I'd never experienced before. Not hurt, not disappointment, but a cold, clear anger that settled in my bones like steel. At the bottom of the box was the real will. Harold had left everything to me. The house, the business, the investments, the savings accounts, everything. There were small bequests for David and Jessica, enough to help them if they truly needed it, but with very specific conditions attached. Any inheritance to my children, the will read, is contingent upon their demonstrating genuine respect and care for their mother for a period of no less than 1 year. This determination will be made solely by Margaret Patterson, and her decision will be final. Harold had given me all the power, but more than that, he'd given me something I'd lost years ago without even realizing it. He'd given me permission to expect better from my own children. I gathered all the documents, placed them carefully back in the box, and rang for Mr. Coleman. Find everything you needed? He asked kindly. Yes, I said, my voice steadier than it had been in weeks. I found exactly what I needed. That evening I called Tom Morrison. His secretary put me through immediately. Margaret? His warm voice came through the phone. I've been expecting your call. Tom Morrison's office was nothing like the sterile conference room where my children had humiliated me. His walls were lined with law books and family photos, and he greeted me with the kind of genuine warmth I hadn't felt since Harold's funeral. Margaret, I'm so sorry for your loss, he said, taking both my hands in his. Harold was one of the finest men I've ever known. Thank you, Tom. He spoke of you often. Tom's expression grew serious as we sat down. I assume you've been to the safety deposit box? I nodded, feeling the weight of everything I'd discovered. I read it all. The messages, the receipts, everything. Harold agonized over this decision, Tom said gently. He loved David and Jessica, but he wasn't blind to what they'd become. He wanted to protect you, but he also hoped that maybe losing their easy access to money might teach them something about respect and responsibility. When did he make the real will? 6 months before his diagnosis. He'd been watching their behavior for a while, keeping records. When he got sick, he updated it one final time to include the provision about earning your approval. I thought about that provision, about Harold giving me the power to determine my children's future. It felt like an enormous responsibility. What happens now? I asked. That's entirely up to you. The fake will they're working with gives them everything, so they'll continue believing that until you decide otherwise. You can let them keep believing it, or you can reveal the truth whenever you're ready. I left Tom's office with a plan forming in my mind. If my children wanted to treat me like I was invisible, I would give them exactly what they expected. I would sit quietly in their meetings, listen to their plans, and let them show me exactly who they really were. The second meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. David had called to inform me that they'd made some progress on the estate issues and needed to finalize a few details. His tone suggested I was lucky to be included at all. I arrived early and took the same seat I'd occupied during the first meeting. The young lawyer was already there, along with David and Jessica. They were laughing about something when I walked in, but the conversation stopped abruptly. "Mom," David said with forced pleasantness, "thanks for coming. We know this is all very overwhelming for you." Overwhelming. As if I were some fragile old woman who couldn't handle complexity. "We've made some good progress," Jessica added, not bothering to look up from her phone. "David found a buyer for Dad's business." My heart clenched. Harold had spent 30 years building that business from nothing. He'd employed dozens of people, some for more than a decade. Their families depended on those jobs. "The buyer wants to close quickly," David continued, "which works out perfectly. We can liquidate everything and divide the assets cleanly." "What about the employees?" I asked quietly. David waved his hand dismissively. "That's not our problem, Mom. The new owner will decide what to do with staff." Harold would have been heartbroken. He'd always treated his employees like family, remembered their children's names, helped them through financial difficulties. The idea of selling to someone who might fire them all would have kept him awake at night. "Now about your living situation," Jessica said, finally putting down her phone. "We found the perfect place. It's a senior community with lots of activities. They have bingo nights and craft classes." Bingo nights and craft classes. As if that was the height of what I might aspire to in my remaining years. The lawyer spread out more papers. "We've calculated the monthly allowance for Mrs. Patterson's expenses. It should cover all necessities plus a small discretionary fund. An allowance. They were planning to give me an allowance from my own husband's estate." "The apartment is really nice, Mom," David said, showing me a brochure. 1 bedroom, 1 bath, everything you need. Much easier to maintain than that big house. I looked at the brochure. The apartment was tiny with beige walls and standard issue furniture. It looked like a place where people went to wait for death. "The house has too many memories anyway," Jessica added with false sympathy. "This will be a fresh start for you. Too many memories." She was talking about the house where she'd taken her first steps, where Harold had taught her to drive in the driveway, where we'd celebrated every birthday and holiday for 28 years. "We'll handle the sale," David assured me. "The real estate market is hot right now. We should get top dollar." They had it all figured out. Sell everything Harold had worked for, divide the money between themselves, and park me somewhere out of the way where I wouldn't be an inconvenience. "There is one small matter," the lawyer said, shuffling through her papers. "The business sale requires signatures from all beneficiaries of the estate." "That's just a formality," David said quickly. "Mom, you'll just need to sign here and initial here." I looked at the papers he pushed toward me. I couldn't understand all the legal language, but I could see Harold's business being reduced to a series of dollar amounts and transaction fees. "What if I don't want to sell?" I asked. The room went silent. David and Jessica exchanged glances. "Mom," David said carefully, "you don't understand business. Dad's company is too complicated for you to manage. Besides," Jessica added, "what would you do with a construction company? You don't know anything about that world." That world. I'd only lived in it for 30 years. Only handled the payroll when Harold was sick. Only knew every employee's name and family situation. "The smart thing is to sell now while the market is good," David continued. "Trust us to handle the financial details. Trust them." The children who'd been planning my exile while their father was dying. "I need time to think about this," I said. David's jaw tightened. "Mom, we can't wait too long. The buyer might move on to other opportunities." "How much time do you need?" the lawyer asked, clearly annoyed at this delay to her tidy timeline. "A week," I said firmly. David started to protest, but Jessica put a hand on his arm. "A week is fine, Mom. Take all the time you need to feel comfortable with this." Her tone was patronizing, as if she were humoring a child who needed to feel important. She was confident that in a week, I'd be back to sign whatever they put in front of me. After the meeting, I sat in my car in the parking lot and watched my children through the conference room windows. They were animated now, talking and gesturing. David was on his phone, probably updating his buyer about the delay. Jessica was laughing at something the lawyer said. They looked relieved that I was gone, free to discuss their real plans without having to pretend I mattered. I wondered what they were saying about me now. Probably complaining about how difficult I was being, how unreasonable it was for me to want time to think about selling my husband's life's work. That night, I called Tom Morrison. I want to let them finish, I told him. I want to see exactly how far they'll go. Are you sure, Margaret? This might get harder to watch. I thought about Harold's letter, about his careful documentation of our children's cruelty. He'd seen what was coming and had tried to protect me from it. I'm sure, I said. They've already shown me who they are. Now I want to see what they think they can get away with. And then I'll show them who I really am. The next week passed slowly. David called twice to check on my decision, each time with less patience. Jessica sent a text reminding me that the apartment they'd found wouldn't be available indefinitely. The pressure was subtle but constant. On Sunday night, David called one more time. Mom, I need to know your decision. The buyer is getting antsy. I've decided, I said calmly. Good, we can meet tomorrow morning to finalize everything. Yes, I said. Let's meet tomorrow morning. What I didn't tell him was that Tom Morrison would be joining us, and that tomorrow morning, my children were going to learn that sometimes the person you've been treating like a fool has been watching and remembering everything. I arrived at the conference room 15 minutes early on Monday morning, my heart surprisingly calm. Tom Morrison was already waiting in the parking lot, just as we'd planned. He would join us 10 minutes after the meeting started, giving my children enough time to show their true colors one final time. David and Jessica were already seated when I walked in, both looking pleased with themselves. The young lawyer had stacks of papers ready for signing, and there was an air of celebration in the room, as if they were closing a particularly satisfying business deal. Mom, you look nice today, Jessica said with false warmth. Are you excited about your new apartment? I'd worn my best dress. The navy blue one Harold had always said brought out my eyes. If this was going to be the last time I sat in a room with my children as their victim, I wanted to look dignified. I think you'll be much happier there, David added. No more worrying about maintaining that big house, no more property taxes and repairs to deal with. They were already spending my money in their minds. I could see it in the way David kept checking his expensive watch, in how Jessica had gotten her nails done for the occasion. This wasn't just about Harold's estate anymore. This was about erasing me from their lives as efficiently as possible. Now then, the lawyer said briskly, we have all the paperwork ready for final signatures. Mrs. Patterson, if you could just sign here where I've marked. She pushed a thick stack of documents across the table to me. I picked up the pen and held it over the first signature line, letting them think I was about to sign away everything Harold had worked for. You know, I said conversationally, not signing anything yet. I was thinking about your father last night, about how proud he was of the business he built. David shifted impatiently. Dad would want us to be practical. Mom, he understood business. He employed 47 people, you know, I continued. Some of them for over 15 years. Frank Martinez has been with the company since David was in high school. His daughter just started college. Mom, Jessica said with exaggerated patience, you can't run a business based on sentiment. The new owner will make his own decisions about staffing. And what about the clients? Harold had relationships with some of those contractors for decades. He gave his word that Patterson Construction would always deliver quality work. The new owner will honor existing contracts, David said dismissively. That's standard business practice, but I could see in his eyes that he didn't know and didn't care what the new owner would do. Harold's reputation, built over 30 years of honest work, meant nothing to his son. I just want to make sure I understand everything I'm signing, I said, still holding the pen. This document sells the business to Morrison Development, correct? The lawyer nodded. That's correct. They're offering fair market value, which will be divided according to your husband's will. And this one transfers the house to a real estate company for immediate sale? Yes, we've already had it appraised. The market is very favorable right now. I flipped through more pages. And this transfers all of Harold's investment accounts to, let me see, David Patterson and Jessica Patterson Webb, in equal shares. That's right, David said, his voice tight with barely controlled impatience. Mom, we've been through all this. You're going to have your monthly allowance and the apartment. You'll be taken care of. Taken care of. Like I was a stray animal they'd found homes for. I set the pen down. You know what I realized, looking through all these papers? They all stared at me, clearly wondering what was taking so long. I realized that in 38 years of marriage, Harold never made a major decision without talking to me first. When he wanted to expand the business, we discussed it. When we bought this house, we looked at dozens of places together. When you children needed money for college, for cars, for your various business ventures, Harold and I talked about every single loan, every payment, every sacrifice we made to help you. Mom, Jessica said carefully, what's your point? My point is that Harold wouldn't have made the most important decision of his life without consulting me. He wouldn't have written a will that left me powerless and dependent on my children's generosity without at least discussing it with me first. The room went very quiet. David's eyes narrowed. What are you saying? I smiled at him. The same smile I'd given him when he was 5 years old and trying to convince me he hadn't eaten the cookies I'd found crumbs of on his shirt. I'm saying that Harold and I talked about his will many times, and the will you've been working from isn't the one we discussed. Before anyone could respond, there was a knock on the conference room door. Tom Morrison walked in carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the kind of confident expression that comes from 30 years of practicing law. Good morning, everyone. I'm Tom Morrison, Harold Patterson's attorney. The young lawyer looked confused. I'm sorry, there must be some mistake. I'm Ms. Patterson's attorney. I've been handling the estate. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding, Tom said pleasantly. I've been Harold Patterson's attorney for 25 years. I have the original will right here. David stood up abruptly. What's going on? Mom, what is this? I looked at my son, this man who'd reduced me to just the widow, and felt a calm settle over me that I hadn't experienced in years. This is the truth, David. Something your father valued, even if you don't. Tom opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick document. This is Harold Patterson's last will and testament, properly witnessed and notarized. The document you've been working from was a preliminary draft that Harold used for planning purposes. Jessica's face had gone pale. That's impossible. Dad showed us the will. He explained everything. Your father showed you what he wanted you to see, Tom said gently. Harold was a careful man. He wanted to understand his children's true character before making his final decisions. I watched my children's faces as the reality began to sink in. David was calculating, already trying to figure out how to regain control of the situation. Jessica looked like she might be sick. In Harold's actual will, Tom continued, the bulk of the estate goes to his wife, Margaret Patterson. This includes the family home, the business, all investment accounts, and personal property. That's ridiculous, David said, his voice rising. Dad wouldn't have done that. He knew Mom couldn't handle business affairs. Your father had complete confidence in your mother's abilities, Tom replied calmly. He specifically noted in the will that Margaret had been his unofficial business partner for decades, handling payroll, customer relations, and administrative duties whenever needed. The young lawyer was frantically shuffling through her papers, clearly realizing that her carefully planned closing had just fallen apart. There are bequests for both children, Tom continued. $25,000 each to be distributed only after a probationary period. Probationary period? Jessica whispered. Tom looked at me, giving me permission to explain. I stood up slowly, looking at both my children. Your father's will states that you'll receive your inheritance only after demonstrating genuine respect and care for me for a period of 1 year. The determination of whether you've met that standard will be made entirely by me. David's face was red with anger. This is insane. You can't hold our inheritance hostage. I'm not holding anything hostage, I said quietly. Your father simply wanted to know that I would be treated with the respect I deserve. If you can manage that for 1 year, you'll receive your inheritance. And if we can't? Jessica asked, though I think she already knew the answer. Then your inheritance will go to the Harold Patterson Memorial Scholarship Fund for Children of Construction Workers. The silence in the room was deafening. David was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. Jessica had tears in her eyes, but I couldn't tell if they were from grief or anger. You planned this, David said finally. You and Dad planned this whole thing. Your father planned this, I corrected. I only found out about it last week. But you're right about one thing. Harold saw exactly who you'd become, and he decided to do something about it. I picked up my purse and walked toward the door. Tom will handle all the legal details from here. As for the business, I've decided to keep it running. Frank Martinez will be the new general manager. I think Harold would approve of that choice. Mom, wait, Jessica called out, panic in her voice. We can work this out. We can talk about this. I turned back to look at her. Now you want to talk? When you thought I was powerless, you were ready to ship me off to some apartment and forget about me. Now that you need something from me, suddenly I'm worth having a conversation with. That's not fair, David protested. We were trying to take care of you. No, I said firmly. You were trying to get rid of me. There's a difference. I walked out of that conference room with my head held high, leaving my children to face the consequences of their choices. For the first time in years, I felt like Harold's true partner again, carrying out the final wishes of a man who had loved me enough to make sure I'd never be anyone's afterthought again. Behind me, I could hear David shouting at Tom, demanding to know how they could contest the will. But Harold had been thorough. The will was ironclad, and my children were about to learn that 30 years of taking me for granted had finally caught up with them. Chapter 6. A New Beginning. 6 months later, I stood in the office that had once been Harold's, watching Frank Martinez review the quarterly reports with a satisfaction I hadn't felt in years. Patterson Construction wasn't just surviving under my ownership, it was thriving. Mrs. Patterson, Frank said, looking up from the spreadsheets, these numbers are better than we've had in 3 years. That new contract with the school district alone will keep us busy through next spring. I smiled, thinking about how David had insisted I couldn't possibly understand the complexities of running a business. It turned out that 30 years of watching Harold work, of handling the administrative details he'd been too busy to manage, had taught me more than my son had ever bothered to learn. How are the new safety protocols working out? I asked. The crew loves them. Nobody wants to get hurt on the job, and knowing that their families are taken care of if something happens, well, it's good for morale. The safety protocols had been my idea, something Harold had always wanted to implement, but never found the budget for. Now that I controlled the finances, investing in our workers' well-being had been my first priority. It was expensive, but it was the right thing to do, and Harold would have been proud. My phone rang as Frank was leaving. David's name appeared on the screen. He'd been calling regularly for the past month, ever since his latest business venture had collapsed and left him with significant debt. Hi, David. Mom, I was wondering if we could have dinner this weekend. Just the two of us. His tone was careful, respectful even. It was a marked change from the demanding voice that had called me just the widow 6 months ago. That would be nice, I said, but you know the conditions haven't changed. I know, I'm not calling about the money, Mom. I'd like to spend some time with you. I believed him, mostly. David's financial troubles had forced him to take a regular job for the first time in his adult life. He was working as a project manager for a construction company in the next county, earning an honest living for the first time in years. The work was humbling him in ways that Harold's bailouts never had. Saturday at 7? I suggested. I'll cook. That sounds perfect. Thank you, Mom. After I hung up, I thought about the changes I'd seen in both my children over the past 6 months. Jessica had been the first to crack, calling me in tears after her husband left her. It turned out that without the promise of Harold's inheritance, Jessica's expensive lifestyle wasn't as attractive to her social circle as she'd thought. I know I messed up, Mom, she'd sobbed during that first phone call. I know I was awful to you. I don't know how to fix this. You start by being honest, I'd told her. With me and with yourself. Jessica had moved back to town, taking a job at the local elementary school as a teacher's aide. It paid a fraction of what she'd been spending on her monthly shopping trips, but she seemed happier than I'd seen her in years. She'd started coming by the house on Sundays, not to ask for anything, but just to talk. Last Sunday, she'd helped me organize Harold's workshop in the basement, something I'd been putting off for months. I remember when Dad taught me to use his drill press, she'd said, running her fingers over the old machine. I was maybe 12, and I wanted to make you a jewelry box for your birthday. I'd forgotten about that jewelry box, how proud she'd been to present it to me with its slightly crooked lid and uneven stain. I still had it in my bedroom dresser. You were so excited, I remembered. You made Dad promise not to tell me what you were working on. I wanted to surprise you. She'd paused, looking around the workshop. I'm sorry I stopped trying to surprise you. I'm sorry I stopped caring about making you happy. Those conversations with Jessica were slowly rebuilding something between us, but I was careful not to let hope override caution. Harold's conditions were in place for a reason. 1 year of genuine respect and care wasn't just about proving themselves to me. It was about proving to themselves that they could change. The biggest surprise had been the impact on Harold's business reputation. Word had gotten out that I'd kept the company running instead of selling it to developers, and that I'd prioritized worker safety and fair wages. 3 new contractors had specifically requested to work with Patterson Construction because they wanted to support a company with those values. Your husband would be proud, Tom Morrison had told me when I'd stopped by his office to sign the paperwork for the school district contract. He always said you were the backbone of everything he built. I'd started attending the monthly meetings of the local business association, something Harold had done for years but had never thought to invite me to. The other business owners treated me with a respect I'd never experienced from my own children. They asked my opinion on local development projects. They valued my insights about employee relations. They saw me as a competent professional rather than just someone's wife or mother. For the first time in decades, I felt like myself again. Not David's mother or Jessica's mother or Harold's wife, but Margaret Patterson, a woman with her own thoughts and her own value. The house felt different too. I'd redecorated Harold's office to suit my own taste, replacing his heavy leather furniture with lighter pieces that let in more natural light. I'd converted one of the spare bedrooms into an art studio, something I'd always wanted but never made time for. On weekends, I painted landscapes of the places Harold and I had talked about visiting, but never had the chance to see. I was planning a trip to Ireland for the fall, something I'd dreamed about since college but had never prioritized over family obligations. The idea of traveling alone didn't frighten me anymore. If anything, it felt like freedom. That evening, as I prepared dinner for David's visit, I thought about the woman I'd been 6 months ago, the woman who'd sat silently while her children dismissed her as irrelevant, who'd accepted their cruelty as normal family dynamics, who'd been ready to sign away everything Harold had worked for just to avoid conflict. She felt like a stranger to me now. David arrived exactly on time, carrying a bottle of wine and looking nervous. He hugged me at the door. A real hug that lasted longer than the perfunctory embraces he used to give me. "The house looks great, Mom," he said, looking around the living room. "You've made some changes." "I decided it was time to make the place feel like mine," I said. "Your father wouldn't have minded." Over dinner, David told me about his job, about the satisfaction he was finding in completing projects with his own hands, instead of just managing other people's work. He asked about the business, listening carefully to my answers instead of dismissing my opinions as he once had. "I owe you an apology," he said as we finished our meal. "Actually, I owe you about 1,000 apologies, but I want to start with one. I was wrong about everything, Mom. About you, about what you're capable of, about what you deserved from us." I looked at my son, this man who'd called me just the widow, and saw something I hadn't seen in years: genuine remorse. "I know I can't undo the way I treated you," he continued, "but I want you to know that I'm trying to become the kind of man Dad raised me to be. The kind of son you deserved all along." We talked until almost midnight, really talked, about his failures and fears, about my loneliness and disappointment, about Harold's legacy and what it meant to honor someone's memory through actions rather than words. When David left, he hugged me again at the door. Hugged me. "I love you, Mom, not because of what you might leave me someday, but because you're my mother, and you deserved better from me." Standing in my doorway, watching my son drive away, I felt Harold's presence in a way I hadn't since his funeral. He would have been proud of the business, proud of the choices I'd made, proud of the woman I was becoming. But mostly, I thought he'd be proud that his final gift to me hadn't just been financial security. It had been the chance to discover my own strength, to demand the respect I'd always deserved, and to build a life that was truly my own. Tomorrow, Jessica was coming by to help me plan the Ireland trip. We were going to look at travel guides and make lists of places to visit. For the first time in months, I was looking forward to spending time with my daughter, not because I felt obligated to, but because I genuinely wanted to. It had taken 63 years, but I was finally living for myself. And Harold, wherever he was probably smiling about that.